Events that led to the Civil Rights Movement. In 1865, the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery is added to the Constitution. In 1896, Supreme Court approves separate but equal segregation ruling. In 1909, National Congress on the Negro meets, which leads to the funding of the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, which is the NAACP. In the 1950s, segregation was witnessed everywhere. In schools, public restrooms, workforce, restaurants, and the biggest of all was the right to vote. During World War II and previous wars, African Americans and whites were not allowed to fight together in the same military base, even though both were fighting for the same cause. As the injustice of segregation to African Americans was growing in the United States, African Americans were fed up with the unfairness of segregation. The death of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old boy who was murdered just for talking to a white woman. This triggered the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement was led by Dr. Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, who followed the lead of W.E.B. Du Bois. An early event was in December 1st, 1955, when Rosa Parks, an African-American female, took the bus and sat in the front seat. Blacks were not allowed to sit in the front seat back then. When Rosa Parks was asked to give up her seat to a white man, she refused and she was arrested for that. This started the Montgomery bus boycott. This meant that blacks refused to ride the bus. Instead, they'd take a cab, walk, or even carpool. This resulted in the government agreeing to desegregate city buses. But interstate buses were still segregated. Here is where the Freedom Riders come in to demand the desegregation of interstate buses. This movement, though, was not going to be as easy as the Montgomery bus boycott was. When the Freedom Riders arrived in the southern cities, people were ready for them. They were physically and verbally attacked. Whites were also involved in this Freedom Riders movement, and they were attacked as well as the blacks. The Freedom Riders buses were burnt down so that they won't find a way back home. But it was worth the while, because interstate buses were desegregated. Then came the idea of lunch counter sit-ins. As we know, restaurants were segregated. Whites would take the best seats in the restaurants, while blacks would take the worst. So students who wanted to end segregation, both blacks and whites, would go and sit wherever they want to sit and don't answer anyone. They would just sit there and talk. For sure they would order, but they would not get served. Some groups had white students with them, so they could order and get served and then give their food to the black students who were with them. These people would go there and they know they would get hurt somehow and get arrested, which is what happened most of the time. But if they were physically and or verbally attacked, they were not to respond back. That was the idea of the nonviolent protest. The nonviolent protest, and I quote, was a philosophy introduced in the Civil Rights Movement by activist Dr. Martin Luther King. However, he adapted his philosophy from Indian independence activist Gandhi. The application of this philosophy took more strength than violence, and King hoped it would catch the attention of society to flatten this discrimination of African Americans. Martin Luther King demonstrated this non-violent protest where he was arrested on April 12, 1963. Martin Luther King was arrested following a non-violent protest demonstrating against segregation in Birmingham, Alabama. Police Commissioner Eugene Bull Connor arrested King for demonstrating without a permit and placed him in Birmingham City Jail for 11 days. During his time in jail, King wrote his famous letter from Birmingham City Jail. Then came the strife to allow African Americans to vote. Voting was only allowed for whites, but since African Americans were citizens as they wanted to vote, and they used the same strategy, which was the nonviolent protest, and the government agreed on giving African Americans the right to vote. But the tricky part was, to register for voting, they would give the blacks a 5-page long questions to answer and give them hard parts from the Constitution to summarize. So basically, they were still not allowed to vote because of the difficulty of the registration test. Even though African Americans were allowed to vote, this didn't end segregation, especially in the southern cities. The southern cities is where blacks were killed, abused, and kidnapped, but no one would pay attention to what happened to these people. Till one day, an African American kid with a company of 2 white boys were reported missing. The fact that there was 2 white people were missing with a black kid caught the attention of the media, governors, and the president. A couple of months later, they were found dead. They were brutally abused by the police, but no one was convicted. Here came the final stage of civil rights movement. Dr. Martin Luther King said in a strategy session that the only way to stop this was to fill the jails, and he asked for volunteers who were willing to go to jail, and no one stood up because they were afraid they would lose everything they owned. Then the children got up and volunteered to go to jail. Dr. Martin Luther King didn't want to get children involved in this, but these children had the motivation that adults didn't have to go to jail for a few nights. So in May 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and May 5th, 1963, thousands of children left their schools to be arrested, set free, and get arrested again the next day. Even though Malcolm X was opposed to the event because he thought it might expose children to violence, he said, and I quote, "Real men don't put their children on the firing line." But the children didn't want to stop till they stopped segregation. When the jails were filled by young children, and the youngest being 4 years old, head of police Bull Connor brought fire hoses to ward off children and set police dogs at the children. The hoses were so heavy that 4 men couldn't hold it. At the end of the first water hose, there was 10 students holding hands singing, "We shall come over." President John F. Kennedy said in a conference that he will put a law to stop segregation all around the country. But before he based this law, he was assassinated. But this law was forced after his assassination. Now we could see in our community and society that everyone is treated equally. Today, our President Barack Obama is an African American. This shows the success of the civil rights movement. Some of the most famous quotes that Dr. Martin Luther King said was, 1. I have a dream that my 4 children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. 2. I came to Nashville not to bring inspiration, but to gain inspiration from the great movement that has taken place in this community. 3. The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in a moment of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. Some organizations that helped organize the civil rights movement was the SCLC, which stands for Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and the CORE, which stands for Congress of Racial Inequality, and the NAACP, which stands for National Association for the Advancement of Colored People.
We will not, by word or deed, for a moment admit the right of any man to discriminate against us simply on account of race or color. Whenever we submit to humiliation and oppression, it is because of superior brute force, and even when bending to the inevitable, we bend with unabated protest. W.E.B. Du Bois, 1904.